You're listening to God, Law, and Liberty with David Fowler and Gary Humble. We're putting culture on a collision course with the truth.
All right, well, welcome to another episode of God, Law, and Liberty. I'm Gary.
And I'm David.
And we've been discussing, liberty of conscience. And as we got into last week, we're starting to build the bridge to common law and natural law. And I'm not sure that we're quite there yet, but we're gonna keep continuing on we're still on the bridge.
Yeah, that's right. We're still on the bridge.
Yeah, sometimes it's hard for us to get off the bridge. So
we're headed there today.
But we're headed there. And and real quick to everyone, thank you for listening. Tell your friends and family who would be interested in this discussion we're having. They can check out God, Law, and Liberty on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, everywhere you listen to podcasts. And if you would like to help us spread this message, it would be incredibly helpful for you to get on the platform that you listen to. Give us a 5-star review, write a review, and that'll just help all the fancy mathematical algorithms that push these things to people who are looking for political discussion or policy discussion for us to pop up. So we'd appreciate you doing that.
Yeah, it does make a difference.
Yeah. So, David, you don't watch porn, right?
No, I don't.
Neither do I.
Nor with my wife.
Right.
Yeah.
Which that's an important. Crazy enough, that's an important thing to say.
Yeah, that's right.
These days. And
some people might say I'd never do it without my wife.
Right. Yeah. Like as if, yeah. Important qualifier there. But it was interesting, as we're discussing the idea of conscience being involved in law, and of course, that introduces the idea or continues the idea of moral legislation and things like that. There was a interesting conversation that popped up in the Twitter sphere this weekend. And there was a disagreement amongst many major conservative commentators on Twitter that I follow a lot of these guys. And what had happened is that Pornhub, arguably the nation or the world's leading purveyor of porn on the internet, put out an Instagram post. And the post featured, my boys and I are huge Star Wars fans, and so there's a new Star Wars series called The Mandalorian, and a really great show. But anyway, they finally show you the origin story of where Yoda comes from, and so on the show there's this baby Yoda, super super cute baby Yoda, and so there's all these memes out there online with baby Yoda. Well, Pornhub posted an Instagram post, and it's this image of baby Yoda. And in Yoda's big eyes is this reflection of the logo of Pornhub. And the statement reads, 10 minutes after my parents leave the house. And so what everybody got up in arms about is obviously Pornhub is now marketing porn to children. They're, baby Yoda, who's a baby, is saying, hey, 10 minutes after my parents leave the house, check me out. I'm watching porn. I'm on Pornhub. And so the internet went crazy, and of course conservatives came on saying, "Hey, we legislate prostitution, we legislate all these. Why are we not legislating or somehow regulating the availability of porn to children?" And so then a bunch of other conservative commentators got on and said, "Hey, wait a minute, that's an infringement on liberty. This is a free speech exercise.
Right.
We can't be stopping all these porn guys. That's increasing the purview of government. We want limited government. We want to make government smaller. You're not a conservative if you want to regulate more." And so anyway, I'm putting that forward because it began this argument over whether or not government and law should somehow be involved in legislating conscience and morality, and how far should government go in that practice where we now say government is too big or no longer limited. So anyway, in the scope of what we have been discussing and what we're going to continue discussing today, that was just interesting that was something that cropped up amongst conservatives this weekend.
Sure. And I think these issues are only going to get bigger between what am I at liberty to do and what am I not liberty to do. And when the government limits that liberty, if I truly live before the face of God, if everybody does, whether they acknowledge him or not, then ultimately the question becomes, how do I live this out in front of God? And are you now binding my conscience in a negative way or in a positive way? And so these are going to be terribly important issues. And one of the reasons that we keep harping on this, and people may feel like, can't you just talk about something else? And we're trying to integrate with, as you indicated, with things going on in the news. But if we don't recur to these foundational, fundamental principles, then we don't know how to use them. And there's a very good book I read years ago that I recently bought and reread again, called Joseph Story and the American Constitution, by a guy named James McClellan. And for anybody that's kind of a legal buff or legal history buff and cares about concepts of the natural law and the role of the Supreme Court in trying to create a union so that we didn't all fall apart again like under the Articles of Confederation, where all 50 states just do whatever they want. There were tremendous battles taking place over these issues of natural law and common law and the Constitution and liberty. And if we don't recur to them, we will lose them. And I just did a commentary last Friday, actually, on dog tags becoming an establishment of religion. Like, are you kidding me? But the point of the story was this Mikey Weinstein, or whatever his name is, had threatened the Army with you're allowing soldiers to print a scripture verse on the backside of their dog tags, and that's the establishment of religion. And if people were listening to what I just said and read the commentary, they said, "Oh, no, David, you said the establishment of religion." And so my commentary pointed out that the Constitution actually says an establishment of religion, not the establishment of religion. And the change in that article by the Supreme Court in 1947 changed the way we understand the Establishment Clause and understand religious liberty claims. And so the point of my commentary is we no longer have religious liberty in our nation. What we have is religious toleration, where government now is the overarching keeper of the consciences of all men. And so if you have a law that has religion in it or is based upon a religious idea, the court can now examine it and say, oh, well, because this is a morals law rooted in Judeo-Christian morality, it's the establishment of religion. And you can't have that law. And then the cake baker sues, and the court says, well, you can't be hostile to religion. If you'll just do it better and not sound so hostile when you're doing it, then maybe you can. But what are we doing? We're essentially, the cake bakers going to the court and asking for liberty to decide not to make this cake. Now, what's fascinating, most people don't realize that, because most of the organizations that work on these cases like to talk in terms of religious liberty because it has a ring to their donors. Religious liberty, but they're really advocating the cases on the basis of free speech, not religious liberty. Because we've lost, really, the notion of religious liberty. We now have religious toleration.
Yeah.
And so we need to understand what's really going on in our courts. And one of the reasons we're going through this exercise, you mentioned this last week, is we've got two pieces of legislation we won't work on. One is the abortion, and trying to ban abortion except to save the life of the mother or prevent irreparable, substantial bodily injury, like paralyzing the mother or something. And then we want to work on this marriage issue. And in both of those cases, we're rooting or basing the statutory law under an understanding of the Ninth Amendment and the common law. A lot of people don't know what the common law is, but they don't know what the common law was based on. The common law was based on the natural law. Mm-hmm. The natural law was based upon what we discussed just last week, that God had written a law in the heart of men.
Right.
And that was natural to us, and it was inherent in the nature of things. And you've talked about that Kuyper had said, there's a lot of natural life development.
Yeah, people do what people do.
People do what people do. They get married. They buy and sell properties. They just do certain things. And in those areas we need to have liberty of conscience. So this is why we're working through this, to help make sure people understand what we're doing on these pieces of legislation. And the critical thing we talked about last week was conscience and how the law affects and shapes conscience. And one of the things that we said regarding this natural law was that though it was, from a biblical standpoint, written into the heart of man in the original Adam, through his fall and as the head of the human race, that relationship with God was severed. His heart and his mind was darkened and polluted, and so we don't see the law clearly. We have our thinking about is often darkened. And one of the verses we didn't go into very much last week that I just mentioned to us is Romans 2:15, where Paul is talking about the person who doesn't have the Bible, and why would they be under the wrath of God? Now, this is important because this is one of the great objections we hear in Christianity all the time, right? Well, what about the wooby-wobby somewhere in the middle of nowhere that's never heard of Jesus Christ and the gospel? How could he be under the wrath of God? And so Paul answers that. He says, I'll tell you how they're under the wrath of God, because that we know that there is a God through the things that are seen. Creation testifies to us about the fact that there is something outside of us that created us. But he goes on in Romans 2:15, and he says they have the work of the law written on their heart. You and I were talking about this earlier. He doesn't say the law is written on their heart, like would have been true with Adam, or the law is written on tablets of stone, like would be true with Moses. But he says they have the work of the law written on the heart. Well, what is the work of the law? Well, part of the work of the law, it says in Romans 2, is that it affirms the good and it punishes the bad, and the righteous laws make clear what's righteous, and laws that punish evil make clear what's not. So consequently, all cultures have laws against murder and stealing. Now, they may have weird views of it. They may say, well, you if you're a Crip, you can kill a blood, but you can't kill a Crip. You can steal from the blood, but you can't steal from a fellow Crip, or whatever it might be, the tribe, on the other side. But we all know that's wrong. We also have the witness of conscience. That's the second thing he says. Every person has a conscience. Now, their conscience may get pretty seared, but we all have one. And it all works on all of us. So we have the witness of conscience. And then he says, and their thoughts accusing or affirming themselves. And I picture that statement saying, here's the third witness. What do? We get in a room down at the legislature, in the courtroom, and we argue back and forth all the time, don't we? Accusing that this is good, or defending this is good, or whatever it is. And what are we necessarily doing? We're saying there is a transcendent thing above our arguments by which our arguments should be judged. I don't go into to say, I don't know if this is a good or bad law or not, and I really don't know whether you should vote for it or not. Thank you for letting me speak. I've never heard that, right? So what are they doing? They're saying you're using a wrong standard that transcends us both. So we have plenty of witness that we know, so we're all guilty before God. But what I don't want to leave readers with thinking, and this is where modern natural law comes in, and this is a distinction we said we had to point to. Original understanding of natural law that undergirded the common law was based on the understanding that God is the creator. And so he's established a law for its creation. And we talked about that man as the creature must therefore conform in every point to the law on which he's dependent. And he must conform to the will of his maker in every point, because he's wholly dependent on his maker. This is called the law of nature. And Blackstone went on, we didn't talk about this at all, but Blackstone said, so how do we know this? He said, well, we know this by two things. One, we've been given reason. So we can know that law in part by reason. But then he adds a very important thing, and he says, and if our reason were as in our first ancestor, perfect and unruffled by passions or desires, he said the talk would be easy and pleasant, and we'd need nothing other than reason. In other words, Adam didn't need to reason. Reason was sufficient. I shouldn't do that. I should do this. This would be good to do. And he said, but we know now, after our first ancestor, that's not the case. So see, William Blackstone is acknowledging creation and the fall. And he said, we find that our reason's just wacky. I mean, what person has not done something they thought was very reasonable and found out later that was a stupid thing to do?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Your reason in the moment may have overcome.
Yeah.
Overcome
Actually, your passion or your prejudice helped you reason to something that was really wrong.
Yeah.
And so he says, so God in his goodness, it almost smacks of Hebrews 1. God has at sundry times spoken through his prophets. He says, so God was good to man, and he gave him revelation by which he could judge what his reason told him. This sounds reasonable. Oh, no, the end thereof is destruction. This sounds reasonable. That's why it is reasonable. It's affirmed in here, see? So Blackstone is very Christian, and he has and it's based upon this natural law. And this natural law is the transcendent law upon which we then work out through our interactions with each other. What is the law that applies to us in our common lives together? And that's how we came up with saying, marriage is a man and a woman. This is what it always seems to be, and it's best that it be one man and one woman. And well, why that? Well, that's where it would seem reasonable to say that a man's sexual libido and so on and so forth could drive him to multiple women, but it could harm the multiple women. They would not have the same focus of attention, blah, blah, blah. But I can then look at Scripture and say God took Adam and joined him to Eve. And so monogamy was the model for that relationship, because God could have made two women and then said, hey, Adam, here, we got the double header today. So he didn't do that, right? And those things are very important. I think you have a quote from this book by McClellan about the difference between the old understanding of natural law and the modern notion of natural law. And we need to make that very clear to people so that when they hear people talking about natural law, they stop and think, which one are you talking about? I think it's on page 71 of the book here. It talks about this reconstituted state of nature, this state of...
Well, you want to read all this?
Yeah, just read some of that. I think it's worth it being read so people hear it.
Well, he basically says that the modern school has rejected the divine origin of natural laws. I mean,
right.
we kind of talked about that humanistic law
right.
Version of natural law, exalted the autonomy of human reason, right. and exhorted man to look for a law of nature in a secularized state of nature, conceived in the mind of man and devoid of theological and historical foundation. The state of nature necessarily varied according to the excognitive genius of each philosopher. And then he goes on to say, little wonder then that the modern concept of natural law, like its intellectual offspring, legal positivism, could be manipulated to impugn or to serve any political system.
That's right. That's right. And he made the statement prior to that what guys like Thomas Hobbes did is he says here, they rejected, it was a distortion of Christian theology. He abandoned the divisions, subdivisions between pure and fallen, perfect and imperfect. He denied the importance of the fall. So man's reason is plenty sufficient. So I'll just figure it out myself. I don't need any revelations. I don't need any God. And in part, you had Thomas Hobbes during this critical period in England dealing with all of these questions between church and state and who was on top in this hierarchy and so on and so forth. And so guys like Thomas Hobbes, who are hostile to religion and hostile to this fight over conscience and what's under the government versus what's under the state, are trying to find a basis for government that leaves God out of it. And so they say, well, we have to start with nature. We have to start with something's in the beginning, which everybody does. And so they create this mythical sort of almost Garden of Eden thing that we're in this state of nature. And we go from there. We don't have any fall. Okay. Now what is very interesting when I taught this at the college level, and I'd have my students read Hobbes. Hobbes would say, in the state of nature, life is nasty, short and brutish, because it's every man against every man. And I thought, see, he's got the fall down. He recognizes we're just generally nasty people. So what do we have to have? We have to have a Leviathan, this huge thing that comes over and imposes itself on us in order to keep peace and tranquility, so man's life is safe. And so he gives up his liberty in order to have security. And boy, isn't that what we're doing today?
Yeah.
Yeah. I can't stand the possibility of liberty. I want security. I want to know I can get a cake, and I want to make sure you're going to make a cake, and I want to make sure you're going to whatever. And so we just let the Leviathan get bigger and bigger and bigger.
Which I think partially was this argument that was transpiring amongst conservatives on Twitter is that, if we legislate, if we legislate limiting the availability of porn to children, then we're some way allowing government to get too big. But honestly, that's not a conservative idea at all. That's a very that is an idea based on removing natural law from law and working as if everything that we do is simply an act of positive law. When the truth is, shouldn't we be working to ensure that our laws match up with that natural law, we keep mentioning, like the law, the work of the law that we know that God wrote on our hearts, because the truth is, and we mentioned this last time as well, for things to be as though they should not be, for things to be the way we know they shouldn't be innately, we have to continue to lie to ourselves, and we have to continue to suppress the truth that is in us. And of course, like the old saying, the longer you believe, the longer you tell yourself a lie, at some point you begin to believe it's the truth.
Sure.
And that's what we have to do to ourselves to get to that place of even questioning whether or not, we should step in and in some way regulate or limit the availability of porn to children. And it's the same thing. There's another report out. I want to get into a bunch of different things, but there's this worldwide report that just came out by this organization. It's basically a primer for governments and NGOs around the world to work towards making healthcare more available to trans youth. Right. And so which is an odd statement to me in and of itself, because the idea that healthcare is how is healthcare limited today simply because you're trans? That really doesn't make any sense to me. I guess if I was progressive, it would, but it just doesn't. But the point is that there's a 65-page document out there that's now gone across to government organizations around the world as to how they can more proliferate the idea of gender fluidity and trans ideology to the youth of the world and make it more acceptable. And
so where does the natural development of the relationship of parent and child and the rights and duties and relationships and the nature of the relationship between parent and child, where does that come in? It doesn't matter. That's right. It absolutely doesn't. It doesn't matter. And we've said this before, we'll say it again. There was a case, I think it was in New York or Massachusetts, where a man had provided sperm to these two women he knew for them to be able to have a baby. They had the baby. They wound up terrible parents. The state came in, took the child, put it in state custody. And the sperm donor, biological father, said, well, I'd like to have custody of the child because it's actually mine, and I'd rather that than it be in state custody in some foster care system. And the state said, why would we do that? The child already has two parents, unless you're saying that there's something to be unique or provided by having a father figure. But we can't concede that because otherwise gay marriage falls apart.
Right.
We can't concede that there is something unique or different about male and female anywhere now. And that's where all of this is going. And so when does this child's right to express and define themselves? That's the first words of the Obergefell decision by the Supreme Court from 2015.
Which again, I want to keep hitting to that point that all of these insane things we're discussing stem from, in large part, at least in America, to the Obergefell v. Hodges decision in 2015.
Right. And prior to that, they were informed by the abortion decisions, which defined what it meant to be human, which then requires you to redefine what it means to be man and woman, male and female. And those distinctions can't exist anymore. And if we allow them to exist, we're making some kind of statement about the relationships in which they don't exist, that they're of a different kind or quality. So we have to suppress the truth that there are differences between men and women.
Yeah.
Now, a couple of years ago, we were working on the issue of boys and girls in bathrooms and locker rooms at public schools. And I really haven't figured out this transgender ideology. It just escapes me, because the testimony we heard, there was a young mother, a mother that came in. She had a high school child, and let's say it was a girl, and he had transitioned to being a boy. Now, we didn't get into asking questions about what changes were made to their anatomy, just how they looked. Mm-hmm. And so this girl's transitioned to a boy, and the concern was, would he be able to go to the boys' restroom and the boys' locker room? And so it was Sally versus the new Sam, I guess you could say. And the person made this very interesting statement. She said, we need to move past binary thinking. And you know, I appreciate our legislators. They were interested in protecting the privacy of children, the exposure of body parts, and all that's well and good. But there's a more fundamental issue, and I wanted to say, so if we need to move past binary thinking, why would we have to transition from male to female? That's binary thinking. Mm-hmm. And if what we are, male or female, is really a subjective mental state, divorced from our bodies, then why does my body have to conform to anything? Now, there would probably be many who would say, that's exactly right, David. Whatever you think you are in the head, you are, and everybody has to respect that. So Gary comes in tomorrow, and he's Gale. He's still got his beard, you know, the whole nine wax, but he's Gale. And I'd say, if you're going to do this thing, do it right. Just say male and female is irrelevant. I am whatever I am in my head. And it's wrong to make me undergo some procedure. It's, you know, whatever it is. And if we're going to stop thinking in a binary way, actually we should say, well, fine. For the non-binary people, we have a third bathroom called the non-binary bathroom. Mm-hmm. So there, we're helping you. But see, she didn't want that. She wanted to think binary. No, she needs to be able to go to the boys' room.
Yeah.
And we were saying, well, we'll offer her the third option, the non-binary option. And so all of this stuff, it's again, this question of there's a law written on our heart and a conscience. There's some things we can't not know. They won't lead us to salvation, but they certainly should prick our conscience and make us think more deeply than we think.
Well, and as we keep breaking away into these more extreme ideologies, are the further we break away from natural law, from what we know exists in the real world, we have to keep making stuff up. I mean, that's the thing. We have to keep reinventing. We have to keep making up new laws just to keep up with the depravity that we continue to create with these ideologies that continue to separate us from the truth of God's word and just from what exists and what's always existed in nature. Sure.
So we've talked here a little bit now over the last couple of days of conscience, the natural law written in the heart of man.
We're going to have to start getting off of this bridge at some point.
We've got this false notion that denies the theological part, but it was the working out of this natural law concept that led to the common law. And it was the law that I guess you could say was common to us as people. It was common to all of us. And it was undergirded by Christianity. Now, that's part of the reason people hate common law, because common law was so clearly tied to Christianity and Christianity's understanding of natural law. That's why, as I mentioned last week, over Thanksgiving, Clarence Thomas was talking about Biden's interrogation of him about natural law and what kind of natural law does he believe in. And Clarence Thomas didn't want to go there because he knew it was a setup. He was damned if he did and damned if he didn't. But that's why the common law is so important. And so the common law were those things that over time, from ecclesiastical law, the canon law, the civil law, we worked out these things that we believed and held to be true about the nature of law. And so when we talked about the rule of law, it didn't mean that we made law according to the rules. It meant that there was a law that transcended us, that to which human laws were subject and to which they should conform. That's what we meant by common law. And because of its tie to Christianity, it's been kind of hated. And because of evolution, we've said there can't be any natural law because there's not any creator to impose it on the creation. So when we talk about the fact that the evolution, what difference does it make what we teach? Well, there's where it's worked itself out in the law. There can't be a common law, and there can't be a natural law because there isn't anybody behind it. And that's exactly what the United States Supreme Court said in 1938. I don't have the quote right here in front of me, but for years, the federal courts in diversity cases, which is a case where, maybe there's a car wreck between me and somebody from Louisiana, and so we go to federal court rather than the court in Louisiana or Tennessee, the state court, because somebody's going to get homered, by the local judge, So you go to the federal court where they didn't have to run for re-election. And the question is, well, what's the tort law here? Were you being negligent, not negligence? What are the remedies? And all of this is common law. Negligence is a common law remedy. Contracts are common law. And so the federal court said, well, because the common law is rooted in a transcendent law, that law is over federal courts and state courts. So we don't have to look at how the state court interpreted the common law in regard to injuries where you're speeding, but this guy's drunk, and now how do you work that out as to who's liable? They said, we're just as capable of looking up into that transcendent law, discerning those principles, and then applying them to the facts of the case as the state judge is. And in leading up to 1938, Oliver Wendell Holmes, a devout atheist Darwinian, said there is no transcendent law to which the common law can apply. The only law, he said, is that of the state. Now, the one good thing, as he said, is that the federal judiciary shouldn't tell each state what its common law was. But we had no business as a federal court deciding what the common law was because there isn't any. There isn't any transcendent source to have common law. And that's what happened. See, you had Oliver Wendell teaching at Harvard. And finally, in 1938, after he's off the bench, the Supreme Court finally agreed with everything he had been writing in his dissenting opinions. We shouldn't be doing this. We shouldn't be citing what the common law is. There isn't any federal common law. There isn't any basis for common law. He said, we like to think that there is, but there isn't. So you see what really transitioned there in 1938 in the law was the Supreme Court says there isn't any transcendent law. There just isn't. And so the whole foundation of the American legal system worked out over centuries, from the Roman law through the canon law, through the common law and the kings of England and all that. Jettiston.
So right there, and kind of leading into our final moments here, can you sort of give a kind of real succinct history of our pathway to which common law was formed? I mean, where are we getting this thing we call? I mean, I know we have the Blackstone commentaries, but I mean, obviously, he had a body of work of which to look at to derive his commentaries from. So how did we arrive at the culmination of jurisprudence that we know of as common law?
Well, a lot of it did arise out of the canon law, the canons of the Catholic Church that decided a lot of various different kinds of disputes regarding family and marriage and inheritance and all those kinds of things, and they really are the working out of general principles that find their point of culmination or their point of origin in the law of God. And so men were looking at what does our reason tell us and what does Scripture tell us? And then how do we reason that, how do we decide whether David made a gift to Gary or he contracted with Gary? So when we send you money every month, am I making a gift to you, or am I, is it an employment relationship, and is it a contract? And so the courts, as these cases would come up, as Gary would say, well, hey, I hadn't been paid for a while. And I said, well, we don't have any contract. Well, you gave me, $2,000 every week, for 10 weeks. Well, those were gifts. No. Don't worry. So the courts began to acknowledge there are these things called contracts. And so what would seem to be necessary and reasonable for there to be a contract? Mm-hmm. And they just began to work them out, and new cases would come up, and they'd say, so how is this case a little bit different from that case? But what's the still underlying fundamental principle that we have to get to? So for example, every law student will take a class in contracts. It's virtually all common law. And they'll say, well, we have to distinguish between donative intent and gifts, and we have to distinguish between what's a contract? A contract has to have a meeting of the minds. There can't be a contract if you're thinking one thing and I'm thinking another thing. And then the court has a case come up where maybe you're an imbecile or you were drunk or whatever it is. Did we have a meeting of the mind? Or was there fraud? And so all of a sudden you come up with a new principle. Fraud vitiates the contract because I thought I was buying a this and you sold me a that. So all those things were worked out over time. And what the courts were saying and what Oliver Wendell Holmes was rejecting is, he said, there are no transcendent principles where we go up here and we say, let's take these principles and then figure out how do they apply to these new facts. And how are these facts similar to those facts, different from those facts, where we can extend the principle, or as C.S. Lewis said in The Abolition of Man, the Tao, the general, how do we extend that to this? How do we extend that? But we never lost that overarching transcendent principle. It was always there. That's what Oliver Wendell Holmes says. There isn't any overarching transcendent principle. But that's what common law, it was the development of those things primarily through the decisions of courts and through the ecclesiastical court systems, where we said, well, this is what constitutes a marriage, this is what constitutes a contract, this is what constitutes a tort and negligence, and here are the defenses to negligence. If you put up a sign that says swimming pool, no lifeguard in attendance, you see those all the time, then you've mitigated your negligence because you'd be stupid to go in there and try to swim anyway and think somebody's going to rescue you. See? Right. So that's how all that worked out. That's what the common law was. And this is important. I'll just say this as we close, because we've probably gone too long. There's a distinction between common law and civil law. And that's the difference that relates to Obergefell and the marriage issue that we'll be dealing with. The difference between civil law and common law. They're two different understandings of legal systems.
And to close the loop, not really close the loop, but kind of to summarize, the common law that we sort of introduced today. I mean, common law essentially is centuries upon centuries of human beings learning how to appropriately deal with each other as we bring issues to be resolved between parties to the courts.
Yeah.
Essentially.
That's right.
And so we have centuries of history of how we've resolved differences between human beings, and that eventually became the law of the land for England, right? I mean, England would still be that that's all they have.
They don't have a written constitution like we do.
They operate by the common law that has developed all of this time. Mm-hmm. Which then became, obviously, us coming from England, that became the basis. That was our understanding of law as we penned the Constitution. So it's really important for people to understand that. And then, we keep bringing up the Ninth Amendment in our arguments. It is the Ninth Amendment that explicitly says that outside of the enumerated laws of the Constitution, that those laws should not disparage
or deny the other rights
that we have, which would be outside of the Constitution, pre-Constitution, and therefore, obviously, those that exist within the common law. Right. So we'll be getting more into that as we dig into this marriage issue and abortion issue that is upon us coming up here in 2020. But it's okay. So we kind of I feel like we're now like maybe 3/4
I think
the
so.
way on the bridge.
I think so. And maybe in our next podcast or the next one after that, we can bring in Professor Adam McLeod, who I've worked with, who testified on the abortion legislation and can help us better understand this question of common law and law.
That is going to be a treat. I will tell you, in the couple times that I've been able to hear him speak, and especially when he gave his testimony in front of the Tennessee Judiciary Committee over the summer. Just a brilliant. I mean, he's one of those guys that has a way of. He's absolutely brilliant, but it's the things that he says really plainly make sense, and so I'm really excited to have him on and really talk about in detail. What we're discussing here regarding the common law. Well, thanks for joining us, and again, make sure to get out and subscribe. We would appreciate your feedback and. Really would appreciate a 5-star review if I'm just being frank.
Yeah, we would.
So give us a 5-star review and then send us an email with your real feedback on the side, if you would. All right. See you next time.
If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to help spread the word, please give us a 5-star review and tell your friends to subscribe too. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you listen to podcasts. God, Law, and Liberty is a podcast of the Family Action Council of Tennessee. We are a 100% supporter-funded nonprofit advocating for family, life, marriage, and religious liberty. For more information, please visit us at www.facttennessee.org. That's facttennessee.org. And please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram @FactTennessee.